So here's a question for you. Are the world's greatest athletes just born different, or are they made through sheer, relentless hard work? Today, we're going to dig into that. We're exploring that amazing space where raw talent, pure genius, and the science of intelligence all come together, and we'll be looking at it all through the world of sports. All right, let's get into it.
You've probably heard this quote from Thomas Edison a million times, but we have to start here, right? It just perfectly sets up the whole debate. Is genius that 1% spark of inspiration, that thing you're born with, or is it really all about that 99% sweat and effort? It's the classic nature versus nurture question, and we're going to see what science has to say about it.
And honestly, there's no better case study for this than the one and only Lionel Messi. I mean, picture this, a tiny kid on the streets of Rosario, Argentina, who's barely bigger than the soccer ball itself, and he's just running circles around everyone. By the time he was just 5 years old, his coaches, his teammates, they all knew. They knew they were watching something totally out of the ordinary. The way he moved, his vision, it was just different. You could already see the sparks of real genius.
But here's the thing, right? Raw talent, no matter how amazing, isn't always a guarantee. When he was just 10, Messi got hit with a huge curveball. He was diagnosed with a growth hormone deficiency. Now, the treatment was going to cost around $900 a month, which was way more than his family could ever afford. Just like that, his entire dream was on the verge of disappearing before it even really got started.
And this is where the story gets kind of wild. It's the stuff of legends, really. When he's 13, the sporting director for FC Barcelona sees him play and is just completely floored. He was so convinced that he signed Messi's first contract right then and there on a napkin in a restaurant. Can you believe that? The club agreed to pay for all his medical bills and bring him into their famous La Masia Academy. And that moment, it's the perfect setup for everything we're talking about today. It shows that even the most incredible raw talent needs the right environment, the right support to really flourish.
Okay, so with Messi's story as our kickoff point, here's how we're going to break this all down. We'll start by figuring out what intelligence even is. Then we'll get into general versus specific smarts, how intelligence can actually change, what practical intelligence looks like, and finally, we'll look at the whole incredible spectrum of what it really means to be intelligent.
All right, let's dive into the science of it all. People have always been curious about this stuff, but the actual formal study of intelligence, that really kicked into high gear back in the late 1800s. You had thinkers like Charles Darwin, Herbert Spencer, and Francis Galton, who were just fascinated by why and how human abilities differed so much from person to person.
So let's get right to it. What is intelligence really? It's super easy to just think of it as being book smart, right? But for scientists who study this, the definition is so much bigger. Think of it as your brain's ability to size up a situation, figure out what's going on, and then decide on the best way to handle it. It's all about adapting, reasoning, and, just solving problems as they come at you.
Okay, so if that's what it is, how do you even begin to measure it? Well, the whole idea really started to take shape back in 1905 with a guy named Alfred Binet. And what's interesting is, his goal wasn't to label kids as smart or not smart, he just wanted a way to find students who might need a little extra help in school. He came up with this idea of a mental age. Then, not long after, William Stern built on that and came up with a formula for the IQ, the intelligence quotient, which basically compares that mental age to your actual age.
And that's where we get the IQ scores that pretty much everyone knows about today. As you can see here, the vast majority of people fall into that average range, somewhere between 90 and 109. And then as you move up the scale, you get into gifted, and finally all the way up into that genius territory, above 145. It's important to remember, though, this is just one standardized way of trying to put a number on something that's incredibly complex.
Okay, so this is super important. We've been throwing these words around, so let's get crystal clear on what they mean. Intelligence is that broad, general mental horsepower we all have. Talent is different. It's that natural knack for something specific, like playing the piano or, being amazing at football. And then there's genius. Genius is what happens when you take that incredible talent and you mix it with true, game-changing creativity and innovation. It's a whole other league.
That idea of general versus specific skills leads us perfectly into our first big theory. Back in the early 1900s, a psychologist named Charles Spearman came along and said, hey, maybe intelligence isn't just one thing. He believed it actually had two key parts.
Spearman's theory is actually pretty straightforward but really powerful. He called the first part the general factor, or just G for short. You can think of G like the processing power of your brain's CPU. It's the core mental energy you use for pretty much everything, from solving puzzles to understanding ideas.
And then you have the specific factors, or S factors. These are your special skills, like your knack for numbers, your verbal ability, or your artistic talent.
So how does this look in the real world? Well, take a tennis great like Novak Djokovic. His high G factor, that general intelligence, is what lets him read his opponent, spot weaknesses, and change his entire strategy on the fly, right in the middle of a match. But that's not enough, right? He combines that with his insane S factors, those super specific, drilled-in skills like his killer serve or his perfect backhand. It's the mix of both that makes him one of the greats.
Okay, so the story doesn't end with Spearman. Another psychologist, Raymond Cattell, took that idea of general intelligence and said, let's break it down even more. He proposed that this G factor is actually made up of two very different kinds of intelligence, and they behave differently as we age.
And this is a really cool idea. On one side, you've got fluid intelligence. This is your raw problem-solving power, your ability to think quickly and adapt to brand new situations you've never seen before. It tends to be at its peak when we're younger. But then there's crystallized intelligence. Think of this as your personal library of facts, skills, and experiences that you build up over your entire life. It's the kind of wisdom that actually tends to get better with age.
But hold on, what about smarts that don't show up on a test? What about real-world intelligence? Well, that's exactly what psychologist Robert Sternberg was thinking. He argued that the old-school views were just way too narrow and that we needed a more practical way to look at things. So he came up with a theory based on three core types of intelligence.
Sternberg's model is pretty easy to remember. First up is analytical intelligence. This is your classic book smarts, the kind of thinking you use to analyze problems and do well on tests. Then there's creative intelligence, which is all about thinking outside the box, coming up with fresh ideas, and adapting to new challenges. And finally, and maybe most importantly, there's practical intelligence. You could call this street smarts. It's knowing how to get things done in the real world. And if you want a perfect example of someone who had all three in spades, look no further than the football legend Zinedine Zidane. Analytically, he was a genius at reading the game, a master tactician. Creatively, oh man, the things he could do with a ball. Pure, unpredictable magic. And practically, he was a born leader. Cool as a cucumber under the most intense pressure. He had the whole package.
All right, our last stop on this tour of theories is one that really blows the whole idea of a single intelligence wide open. Howard Gardner came along and basically said, forget about one type of smarts. He argued that we actually have multiple, totally separate kinds of intelligence.
And when you think about sports, this makes a ton of sense. Of course, you have bodily kinesthetic intelligence. That's the genius of physical movement. You have visual spatial intelligence, which is all about seeing the field and knowing where everyone is and will be. You've got logical mathematical intelligence for strategy and tactics. And believe it or not, even linguistic intelligence, being good with words, can be an athlete's secret weapon.
I mean, just think about the great Muhammad Ali. Obviously, his bodily intelligence was off the charts. Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. That's pure physical genius. But his linguistic intelligence was just as deadly. The rhymes, the trash talk, the powerful speeches, he used words as a weapon to build his own myth and to completely dominate his opponents mentally. He often had the fight won before he even stepped in the ring.
And that brings us to this final thought, which I think just wraps everything up perfectly. It's from the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. He said, talent hits a target no one else can hit. Genius hits a target no one else can see. And that's really it, isn't it? Talent is about incredible skill. But genius? That's that combination of everything we've talked about. It's about seeing possibilities that are invisible to the rest of us. Which just makes you wonder, what targets are the geniuses of tomorrow seeing right now?